Let's raise a glass to the woman who's finally learning when to step aside, my daughter-in-law said, smiling as she lifted her wine glass across the dinner table. Everyone laughed. Even my son. I smiled too. At least on the outside. Inside, something quietly broke. My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm 69 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that moment, I believed I still had a place in my family. The dinner was Ashley's idea. She had called me 3 days earlier with unusual warmth in her voice. We're overdue for a real family dinner, she had said. Everyone misses you. Those words stayed with me longer than they should have. After my husband passed away 18 months ago, invitations had become rare. Family gatherings seemed to happen without me more often than with me. So when Ashley called, I allowed myself to hope. That afternoon, I arrived early carrying a casserole dish that Ryan had loved since he was a little boy. The smell of baked cheese and herbs filled the kitchen as I set it on the counter. Ashley greeted me with a hug that felt practiced. Not cold, not warm, just enough. Their house looked beautiful. Fresh flowers decorated the dining table. Soft music played from hidden speakers. Family photographs lined the walls. Looking at them, I noticed something strange. The newer photos included everyone except me. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss. Still, it settled heavily in my chest. Guests began arriving shortly afterward. Ryan's co-workers, a few neighbors, Ashley's sister and her husband. Everyone seemed relaxed and cheerful. Ryan greeted me with a quick hug before returning to a conversation near the patio doors. I watched him laugh at something Ashley said. He looked happy, happier than I had seen him in months. For a moment, I convinced myself that tonight would be different. Maybe we were finally finding our way back to each other. Dinner started smoothly. People complimented the food. Stories were shared. Glasses clinked. Laughter filled the room. I listened more than I spoke. That had become my habit lately. The older you get, the more invisible you become. People stop asking questions and start assuming answers. As the evening continued, Ashley seemed to become the center of every conversation. She moved effortlessly around the table, making everyone laugh. Then she stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. The room fell silent. Before dessert, she said, I'd like to make a toast. Everyone turned toward her. I smiled politely and folded my hands in my lap. To family, she began. To new beginnings. And to knowing when it's time to pass the torch to the next generation. A few people nodded. Then her eyes found mine. And especially to Margaret, she continued. The woman who's finally learning when to step aside. The laughter came immediately. Not loud. Not cruel. Just enough to sting. My eyes shifted to Ryan. For a second, I expected him to say something. Anything. Instead, he chuckled softly and raised his glass. That hurt more than Ashley's words ever could. I lifted my own glass and smiled. Nobody noticed how tightly I was holding it. Nobody noticed the silence growing inside me. As conversations resumed around the table, I realized something important. This dinner had never been about bringing the family together. It had been about sending a message. And for the first time, I was finally ready to hear it. I stayed for another 30 minutes after the toast. Long enough to avoid drawing attention to myself. Long enough to prove that Ashley had not succeeded in embarrassing me publicly. At least not in the way she intended. I smiled when people spoke to me. I complimented the dessert. I thanked Ashley for hosting. Then I picked up my purse, hugged my son goodbye, and drove home through the quiet Dallas streets. The moment I stepped inside my house, the silence felt different. Usually, it comforted me. That night, it felt honest. I hung my coat by the front door and stood in the living room for several minutes without turning on a single light. Moonlight filtered through the windows and rested across the hardwood floors. The same floors my husband and I had chosen together almost 20 years earlier. I could still hear his voice sometimes when the house became quiet enough. Not real words, just memories. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought I would feel angry. Instead, I felt something colder. Clarity. Ashley's toast had not come out of nowhere. It was only the first time she had stopped hiding. As I sat at the kitchen table, memories began returning one after another. Small moments. Easy to dismiss when viewed alone. Impossible to ignore when placed together. 3 years earlier, Ryan had forgotten to invite me to Emma's school recital. Ashley said there had been confusion about the date. 2 years ago, they celebrated Thanksgiving with friends instead of family. Ashley explained that everyone needed a change of tradition. Last Christmas, I learned through social media that they had hosted a large holiday gathering only 15 minutes from my house. When I asked Ryan about it, he looked genuinely surprised that I had not known. At the time, I blamed poor communication. Tonight, I started wondering if poor communication had never been the problem. I opened a drawer and removed a photo album. The pages were filled with snapshots from years when family still felt simple. Ryan fishing with his father at Lake Texoma. Birthday parties. Backyard barbecues. Summer vacations. In every picture, there was laughter. There was connection. There was effort. Then I noticed something else. The newer photographs became increasingly centered around Ashley. Every holiday. Every gathering. Every milestone. Slowly, almost invisibly, the family story had changed. I had not been pushed out all at once. I had been edited out a little at a time. The realization sat heavily on my chest. Around midnight, my phone vibrated. A message from Ryan appeared on the screen. "Hope you made it home safely, Mom. Thanks for coming tonight." I stared at the words for a long time. No mention of the toast. No acknowledgement of what happened. No apology. Just a polite message that could have been sent to any guest. I typed several responses before deleting them all. Finally, I set the phone face down on the table. Across the room, a framed photograph of my late husband sat on the bookshelf. He was smiling in that picture, one arm around my shoulder. Looking at it, I remembered something. He used to tell me whenever a situation felt confusing, "Pay attention to patterns, Margaret. People reveal themselves through repetition." That night, for the first time, I stopped making excuses for what I was seeing. And once I allowed myself to see the pattern, I realized the dinner was not the beginning of the story. It was only the moment the mask finally slipped. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen over the neighborhood, and the air outside still carried the coolness of the night. I made coffee and sat by the kitchen window, staring at the oak tree in my backyard. For years, I had started my mornings the same way. Coffee, quiet, reflection. But that morning felt different. Instead of wondering whether I had somehow failed my family, I found myself asking a different question. How long had this really been happening? After breakfast, I opened my laptop and began sorting through old photographs, emails, and holiday invitations. At first, I told myself I was simply being nostalgic. But deep down, I knew I was looking for answers. One by one, the memories returned. There was Emma's 8th birthday party. Ashley had told me the celebration would be small, just immediate family. 2 days later, photographs appeared online showing more than 20 guests gathered around a beautifully decorated backyard. There was the 4th of July barbecue I learned about after it happened. The family weekend trip to Austin that somehow never came up in conversation. The anniversary dinner where Ryan told me they had forgotten to send an invitation. At the time, each incident seemed harmless on its own. People were busy. Plans changed. Mistakes happened. But viewed together, they painted a very different picture. Around noon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma. My granddaughter had just turned 16, and unlike most teenagers, she still called instead of sending text messages. Her voice sounded hesitant when I answered. "Grandma, are you busy?" she asked. "Not at all, sweetheart," I said. There was a brief silence. Then she spoke again. "I wanted to check on you after dinner." Something in her tone immediately caught my attention. "That is very kind of you," I replied carefully. "I am doing fine." Another pause followed. "Grandma," she finally said, lowering her voice. "I do not think what Mom said was funny." I closed my eyes. For the first time since the dinner, someone had acknowledged what happened. "Thank you," I said softly. Emma hesitated again. "Honestly, she says things like that a lot when you are not around." My grip tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" I asked. I could hear her moving into another room before answering. "Whenever family events come up, she complains. She says you make everything about yourself. She says Dad feels guilty around you. Sometimes she jokes that you still think you run the family." The words landed heavily, but not because they surprised me. Deep down, I had already suspected something similar. What surprised me was hearing it spoken aloud, hearing confirmation from someone who had witnessed it. Emma continued carefully. "I always thought Dad knew what she was saying. But after dinner, I am not so sure anymore." I stared out the window as she spoke. The oak tree swayed gently in the breeze. Everything outside looked peaceful. Inside, however, years of confusion were slowly turning into understanding. Before ending the call, Emma said something I could not stop thinking about. "Grandma, I do not think last night was really about a joke. I think Mom wanted everyone to see you differently. After we hung up, I remained seated at the table for a long time. Because for the first time, I realized I was not imagining the pattern. Someone else had seen it too. After my conversation with Emma, I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about something my husband used to say. He believed that the truth rarely arrived all at once. Most of the time, it appeared in pieces, quietly waiting for someone willing to connect them. For years, I had ignored those pieces. Not because I was foolish, but because I wanted peace more than I wanted answers. That evening, I walked upstairs to the study that had belonged to my husband. Very little had changed since he passed away. His favorite leather chair still sat beside the window. His reading glasses remained on the corner of the desk. Even now, entering that room felt like stepping into a conversation that had only paused rather than ended. I opened a cabinet and began sorting through old files. At first, I was simply looking for documents related to the house. Ryan had recently made several comments about property taxes, maintenance costs, and how difficult homeownership could become as people grew older. At the time, I assumed he was concerned about me. Now I wondered whether those conversations served a different purpose. Inside one folder, I found records showing how much financial help my husband and I had given Ryan over the years. The numbers surprised even me. There was the down payment for his first house, assistance when he started his business, tuition support when he decided to earn a second degree, emergency funds during difficult years. None of it had been a burden. We had given gladly because that is what parents do. But looking at the pages spread across the desk, I realized something painful. Ashley often spoke as though everything Ryan owned had been earned entirely on his own. The sacrifices behind those achievements had quietly disappeared from the family story. As the sun began setting outside, another memory surfaced. 5 years earlier, shortly after Ashley joined the family, she had suggested that Ryan should take a more active role in managing family assets. The comment seemed harmless then, practical even. Over time, similar conversations followed. Discussions about property, investments, future planning, retirement options. Looking back, I noticed a pattern. Ashley rarely pushed directly. Instead, she planted ideas and allowed them to grow. People often imagine manipulation as something dramatic. In reality, it can be subtle. A suggestion here, a comment there, a question repeated often enough to sound like common sense. Around 7 o'clock, I received another message from Ryan. This one felt different. He asked whether I wanted to join them for brunch the following weekend. Reading it, I felt a familiar temptation to pretend everything was normal, to accept the invitation, smile politely, and continue ignoring what had become impossible. To ignore. But for the first time, I paused before responding. My husband had taught me many things during our 43 years together. One lesson stood above the rest. Respect matters more than comfort. Families survive disagreements. They survive mistakes. What they cannot survive is the slow erosion of respect. I set my phone aside without answering immediately. Then I returned to the desk and continued reviewing the files. Because somewhere beneath years of polite smiles and careful omissions, I had begun to sense that there was a larger plan unfolding. And if I wanted to understand what was really happening, I needed to stop looking at isolated moments and start examining the whole picture. 2 days later, I decided to stop relying on memories and start looking for facts. There is a difference between suspicion and evidence. Suspicion keeps you awake at night. Evidence changes the way you see the world. On Thursday morning, I scheduled a meeting with an old family friend named Harold Bennett. Harold had been my husband's accountant for more than 20 years. He retired shortly before my husband passed away, but we still exchanged Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. If anyone understood the history of our family's finances, it was Harold. We met at a small cafe near downtown Dallas. The place smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries. Harold arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the same calm expression I remembered from years ago. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he looked at me carefully. "You did not invite me here to discuss the weather, Margaret." I smiled faintly. "No, I did not." For the next hour, we talked about family, finances, and changes that had occurred during the last several years. I was careful not to make accusations. I simply asked questions. Harold listened more than he spoke. That alone told me something. Toward the end of our conversation, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your husband worried about one thing near the end," he said quietly. My heart tightened. "What was that?" Harold hesitated before answering. He worried that people might start viewing family assets as entitlements instead of blessings. The words lingered between us. They sounded exactly like something my husband would say. Harold continued. He believed gratitude was becoming less common. He noticed certain conversations changing. I immediately thought about Ashley. Property discussions. Future planning. Assumptions disguised as suggestions. Harold never mentioned her name, but he did not need to. Before we left, he gave me a piece of advice. If you feel something is wrong, do not argue with people about it. Observe. People reveal their intentions when they believe nobody is paying attention. I drove home thinking about those words. That evening, Ryan finally called. His voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. He asked whether I had seen his message about brunch. I told him I had. Then, almost casually, he mentioned something that caught my attention. Ashley found a great retirement community outside Fort Worth, he said. You should look at it sometime. Just for future planning. I remained silent for a moment. Retirement community. The phrase sounded strangely familiar. Not because it was a bad idea. Many wonderful people choose that lifestyle. But hearing it now, after everything else, felt different. That is thoughtful, I replied carefully. Ryan sounded relieved, as though he expected resistance. We spoke for another few minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the family photographs on the mantel. The pattern was becoming clearer. First came the jokes, then the exclusion, then the subtle conversations about stepping aside, about making room, about future plans. None of it felt accidental anymore. For years, I had viewed each event separately. Now I was finally seeing the larger picture. And what troubled me most was not Ashley's behavior. It was the possibility that she had been building this narrative for years while everyone else slowly accepted it as normal. As darkness settled outside my windows, I opened a notebook and began writing down everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, incidents, comments. By the time I finished, several pages were filled. Looking at them, I felt something. Unexpected. Not anger. Not fear. Determination. Because for the first time since that dinner, I realized I was no longer trying to understand whether there was a plan. I was trying to discover how far it had already gone. The following Monday, I returned to my husband's study with a purpose I had not felt in a long time. For years after his passing, I entered that room to remember him. Now, I entered it to understand him. The notebook I had started over the weekend sat open on the desk beside several folders and financial records. I spent hours reviewing old correspondence, property documents, and estate paperwork. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Insurance policies, tax records, investment statements. Then, near the back of a filing cabinet, I discovered a folder I did not recognize. The labels simply read, Personal Instructions. My pulse quickened slightly as I opened it. Inside were several letters written in my husband's familiar handwriting. Some were addressed to me. Others were intended for our attorney if certain circumstances ever arose. I carefully unfolded the first page. The letter was dated almost 2 years before his passing. His words were calm and direct, exactly as I remembered. He wrote about family, about gratitude, about responsibility. Most importantly, he wrote about the difference between helping someone and allowing them to become entitled. As I continued reading, I found a passage that stopped me cold. He explained that he had become increasingly concerned about conversations surrounding family assets and future inheritance. He did not accuse anyone by name. That was not his style. But he clearly sensed a shift occurring within the family dynamic. He worried that some people were beginning to view future resources as something already belonging to them, rather than something to be earned through trust and respect. I sat back in my chair and stared at the page. Harold had been right. My husband had noticed the same pattern years ago. The difference was that he had quietly prepared for it. Near the bottom of the folder was a business card belonging to our longtime attorney, Daniel Mercer. I had not spoken with Daniel in nearly a year. Before I could talk myself out of it, I picked up the phone and called his office. To my surprise, he remembered me immediately. We scheduled a meeting for Wednesday afternoon. For the next 2 days, I found myself thinking constantly about what might be waiting inside that office. Part of me worried I was imagining connections where none existed. Another part remembered the letter resting inside my study. By Wednesday, curiosity outweighed hesitation. Daniel's office occupied the top floor of a downtown building overlooking the Dallas skyline. He greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he opened a file and placed it on the table between us. Your husband was a careful man, he said. He believed preparation prevented conflict. I nodded. That sounded exactly like him. Daniel reviewed several estate documents before arriving at a section marked confidential instructions. According to the records, my husband had established additional protections regarding certain family assets. Not because he distrusted me. Quite the opposite. He wanted to ensure that no one could pressure me into decisions that did not serve my interests. The more Daniel explained, the clearer everything became. My husband had anticipated the possibility that someone might eventually encourage me to sell property, surrender control, or make major financial decisions before I was ready. He had created safeguards specifically designed to prevent that from happening. As I left the office later that afternoon, I felt something I had not experienced since the dinner. Confidence. Not because I planned to confront anyone. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I finally understood something important. While others may have assumed I was alone, my husband had quietly prepared for a future he feared might come. And now, for the first time, I suspected there were people in my family who had absolutely no idea those protections existed. After meeting with Daniel Mercer, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not confront anyone. Not yet. For years, I had reacted emotionally whenever family tensions appeared. I tried to explain. I tried to smooth things over. I tried to preserve harmony. This time, I chose something different. I chose patience. Over the next several days, I accepted Ryan's invitation to brunch. My response was warm, polite, and completely ordinary. If he found my behavior unusual, he did not show it. Neither did Ashley. In fact, when Sunday arrived, Ashley seemed unusually cheerful. She greeted me at the door with the same practiced smile she always wore when other people were watching. The brunch itself felt pleasant on the surface. Pancakes, fruit, coffee, and casual conversation filled the morning. Emma sat beside me and occasionally met my eyes across the table. There was something reassuring about knowing I was no longer the only person who recognized what was happening. As the meal continued, I noticed something interesting. Ashley brought up future planning 3 separate times. Not directly. Never directly. Instead, she mentioned rising property taxes. Then she talked about a neighbor who had recently moved into a retirement community. Later, she shared a story about a widow who sold her large house and simplified her life. Each comment sounded harmless by itself. Together, however, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Ryan joined the conversation as though the topics were completely natural. A lot of people downsize eventually, Mom, he said while stirring his coffee. Less maintenance. Less stress. I nodded thoughtfully. I suppose that depends on the person. Ashley smiled. Exactly. Some people enjoy having more freedom. Freedom. The word lingered in my mind long after the conversation moved on. Freedom was an interesting way to describe giving up a home filled with memories. Still, I remained calm. I asked questions. I listened carefully. Most importantly, I gave them no reason to suspect I knew anything about the protections my husband had established. By the end of brunch, I had learned something valuable. They were becoming increasingly confident. People are often most revealing when they believe success is inevitable. 2 days later, that confidence revealed itself again. I received a phone call from Ryan while I was working in my garden. He sounded excited. A friend of his had recently become a real estate consultant specializing in retirement transitions. Ryan suggested I meet her for advice. Advice. Another seemingly innocent offer. I thanked him and promised to think about it. After ending the call, I sat on my backyard patio and watched the afternoon sunlight move across the lawn. Everything suddenly seemed clearer than it had a week earlier. Nobody was forcing me to do anything. Nobody was making demands. Instead, they were carefully guiding a narrative. A narrative where moving out appeared wise. Where stepping aside appeared responsible. Where surrendering control appeared inevitable. The strategy was subtle. That was what made it effective. That evening, I opened the notebook again and added several new observations. The list continued growing. So did my understanding. By now, I no longer questioned whether a plan existed. The only question remaining was how far Ashley expected that plan to go. And judging by her growing confidence, I suspected she believed the outcome was already guaranteed. What she did not know was that for the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to the story she wanted me to believe. I was quietly preparing to reveal the one she had never seen coming. 3 weeks after the dinner, I received another invitation from Ashley. This time, she wanted a larger family gathering before the holidays. Her message was cheerful, full of exclamation points and warm words about bringing everyone together. I accepted immediately. The response seemed to surprise her. Over the next few days, she sent additional messages about the menu, the guest list, and how excited she was to spend time with family. I replied politely and gave no indication that anything had changed. When the evening finally arrived, I drove to Ryan and Ashley's house feeling calmer than I had in months. Cars lined the driveway and the street beyond it. Through the windows, I could see relatives moving from room to room, carrying plates and laughing. Everything looked warm and welcoming. Ashley greeted me at the door with a bright smile. Ryan hugged me. Emma squeezed my hand quietly as I walked. Inside, for the first hour, the evening felt perfectly ordinary. Conversations flowed easily. Children played in the living room. Music drifted softly through the house. Then, just as I expected, the conversation began to shift. It started with a discussion about retirement. Someone mentioned a friend who had recently moved into a smaller home. Ashley immediately joined in. She spoke about convenience, freedom, and simplifying life. Several guests nodded politely. Ryan added that many people felt happier after downsizing. Then Ashley turned toward me with a smile that seemed carefully rehearsed. "Margaret, have you ever seriously considered it?" she asked. The room grew quieter. "Considered what?" I asked. "A simpler lifestyle," Ashley replied. "A place with less maintenance and fewer responsibilities. You deserve that kind of freedom." She reached beside her chair and picked up a glossy brochure. "Actually, Ryan and I found a wonderful retirement community outside Fort Worth. Beautiful grounds. Great amenities. We thought you might love it." The brochure sat on the table between us. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Ryan cleared his throat. "We just want what is best for you, Mom." I looked at the brochure for several seconds. Then I smiled. "That is very thoughtful," I said. Relief immediately appeared on Ashley's face. She seemed convinced the conversation was finally going where she wanted it to go. Then I folded my hands and spoke again. "Before we discuss my future, there is someone I invited who should hear this conversation." Confusion spread across several faces. Ashley blinked. Ryan frowned slightly. A moment later, the front door opened. Daniel Mercer stepped inside. The room fell silent. Daniel greeted everyone politely before taking a seat near the dining table. Ashley looked completely caught off guard. Ryan appeared equally surprised. Daniel thanked everyone for allowing him a few minutes. Then he calmly explained that he had recently reviewed several estate documents at my request. He made one thing very clear. Every property, asset, and major decision remained entirely under my control. No recommendation, suggestion, or outside influence could change that. Then he unfolded a single sheet of paper. "Your late husband left specific instructions," he said. He read a short passage aloud. "If Margaret ever feels pressured to surrender her independence, she should remember that this family was built for her security, not her replacement." The words seemed to drain every sound from the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Ashley stared at the table. Ryan looked stunned. For months, perhaps years, assumptions had quietly grown inside this family. That evening, those assumptions finally met the truth. And for the first time since my husband passed away, I watched the balance of the room shift completely in my direction. The silence remained long after Daniel finished reading my husband's words. No one seemed quite sure what to say next. Conversations that had felt effortless only minutes earlier now seemed impossible to restart. One by one, guests began gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes. Some offered polite smiles. Others squeezed my shoulder as they passed. A few simply nodded, as though they had finally understood something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Before leaving, Emma walked over and wrapped her arms around me. "I am proud of you, Grandma," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head and smiled. Those words meant more to me than any legal document ever could. By the time the last guest left, only Ryan, Ashley, and I remained. The house felt strangely quiet. Ashley busied herself clearing dishes that did not need clearing. Ryan stood near the kitchen island, staring at the floor. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then I picked up my purse and headed toward the front door. Ryan followed me outside. The night air was cool, and the neighborhood sat peacefully beneath the glow of streetlights. We stood beside my car in silence. Finally, Ryan looked up. His eyes seemed older than they had a few hours earlier. "Mom," he said softly. I am sorry. I studied his face. For the first time in a long time, I believed he meant it. But sincerity and understanding are not always the same thing. I believe you are sorry, I replied. Ryan nodded slightly. Then I continued. What I do not know is whether you understand what happened. His expression tightened. I think I do. Do you? I asked gently. Because the problem was never the house. He looked confused. Then what was it? I took a slow breath. The problem was that somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. The words settled between us. Ryan lowered his eyes immediately. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. That told me everything I needed to know. When your father and I helped you buy your first home, we did it because we loved you. I continued. When we helped during difficult years, we did it because family matters. None of it came with conditions. None of it came with expectations. Ryan remained silent. But respect should never have been negotiable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distant sound of a passing car drifted through the neighborhood. Then Ryan finally looked at me again. I should have paid more attention. Yes, I said quietly. You should have. There was sadness in that moment, but surprisingly little anger. Anger had left me weeks earlier. Understanding had taken its place. I reached for my car door, then paused. Your father left me this home, I said. But the greatest thing he left me was the wisdom to recognize when respect had left the room. Ryan's eyes filled with emotion. He nodded slowly, as though he finally understood the lesson his father had tried to leave behind. I wished him good night and got into the car. As I drove away, I felt no desire for revenge, no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong. What I felt instead was peace. The kind of peace that comes when confusion finally gives way to clarity. Families are not measured by who inherits the house. They are measured by who remembers the people who built it. And that night, for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I belonged. Not because someone gave me permission, not because a document confirmed it, but because I had finally remembered my own worth.